Hello again, everyone. I'm Father Joe Nazzle from Sonino Mission House in Berkeley. The first reading for this Sunday's Eucharist is from the prophet Isaiah. It's a passage that's often used at funeral masses. 10 years ago, when my sister Mary died unexpectedly at the age of 47, we chose this reading from Isaiah, partly because one of our favorite memories of Mary is that every Christmas, for the last several years before she died, she would host the Christmas Day celebration. And it was a wonderful feast filled with all kinds of rich food and choice wines, with a honey-baked ham as kind of the centerpiece. We felt it was appropriate then to reflect how heaven is depicted in the prophet Isaiah's writings as this feast on God's holy mountain that is filled with the choice wines and rich food, rich and pure choice wines. The vision of the picnic on God's holy mountain that will last forever is linked with the prophet's bold proclamation that God will destroy the veil that veils all peoples, that the web that is woven over all nations, that God will destroy death forever. And we hear how this feast will be filled with joy because God will wipe away all the tears from every face. There'll be no more reproach or reprimand. God will welcome all to this feast, and people will respond, "Behold, here is our God who's come to save us. Let us rejoice and be glad." And then there's that final image in Isaiah about this holy mountain where the feast will take place. Isaiah says the hand of God will rest on this holy mountain. Now, wherever the hand of God rests, there's welcome, there's food, there's drink, there's joy, that the hand of God wipes tears from our eyes. In recent months, with hundreds of thousands of people who died from coronavirus, with all the hurricanes and fires and floods and chaos, some people have been thinking that God has had a hand in all of this, that God is so angry that God is letting us know we need to change our ways. In other words, they view the hand of God not as just gentle hand open and welcome, but kind of a backhand across our face, or maybe a stinging hand of reprimand across our bottom. But the prophet Isaiah images the hand of God as a gentle hand resting upon our shoulders, extended in welcome, affirming, compassionate. The hand of God tenderly wipes tears from our eyes. The hand of God rests on the earth's shoulders. And when the hand of God rests upon us, the world finds peace. This inclusive and compassionate and gentle vision of God's holy mountain stands in sharp contrast to the parable in the gospel of the wedding feast. It's one of the strangest and most difficult stories Jesus tells to digest and to understand. Scholars suggest that Matthew really combines two parables here. The first one reflects how the message of Jesus was rejected by the religious leaders. But even those who respond to Jesus' invitation must come to the wedding feast wearing the garment of grace, which kind of forms the second parable. I always thought it was unreasonable to expect some homeless guy who's invited to the banquet at the last minute to have a tuxedo in storage somewhere. Still, it's a violent and gruesome story of murder and mayhem. And when the king holds this wedding feast for his son, instead of simply declining the invitation, the people do violence to those who are handing out the invitations. And here the hand of God is violent and vindictive, destroying those who laid hold of his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king has his troops kind of come in and destroy everyone, but invite those good and bad that are still around to fill the hall with guests. The first parable ends there, and in a sense, it's a familiar theme of Jesus. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. This kind of fits into the image of Isaiah in the first reading, though the violence and retribution do not reflect the gentle face and the open hands of God. What the second parable, which Matthew seemingly tacks on and makes the parable the gospel even more incomprehensible, is this poor guy who's dragged in off the street to attend the wedding, but isn't properly dressed. Proper attire required is not the sign that I would expect to see on heaven's door, and yet that certainly seems to be the case here. The most disturbing line, though, is the one who stands, and the one that stands in direct opposition to the image from the first reading, where everyone seems to be welcome, is the line where Matthew writes, "Many are invited, but few are chosen." So while embracing the vision of Isaiah in the first reading of a feast for all, what do we do with this gospel, this strange and violent parable in the gospel? From the behavior of the invited guests who kill the messengers to the king's shock and awe response by sending troops to destroy those murderers and burn their city, which again scholars suggest is reference to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans 40 years after Jesus. The picture that Matthew paints here is far from a portrait of a peaceful and inclusive Jesus who teaches us how to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. Further upsetting our expectations about Jesus is the second part of that parable, where the king remembers after all the carnage and after all the slaughter, oh, that's right, there's a feast that's ready. Never mind that the food is probably cold by now because of all the slaughtering that has taken place. So the king invites all the marginalized, the poor, the outcasts to the banquet, only to throw one of them out because he's not properly dressed. One interpretation of these two parables is that they don't represent God necessarily, but that they represent us, the church, that we are sometimes judgmental. We throw a party every Sunday, but even before the pandemic and the shelter-in-place orders and the limited number of people who can come to church, even before all of that, attendance at this feast was slipping because the church, frankly, has had some issues with hypocrisy and exclusionary practices. Instead of providing a banquet of plenty for all, it seems that some in the church would only want those they deem worthy to attend, even though we openly say before receiving Eucharist, "Lord, I am not worthy to receive you." This parable has many problems, and it's more puzzling rather than promoting an image of God that is compassionate and merciful. So perhaps the point of the two parables wedded together in this unhappy marriage is that the feast of the kingdom of God will be for all, but we have a choice. We can accept or reject the invitation. And if we accept, then the proper attire required is that of the garment of grace. We must commit ourselves to living this vision, this message of Jesus, of truth and justice and mercy and compassion and love, every day of our lives, that we clothe ourselves with this garment of grace as we open our hands and our hearts to one another. I pray you have a very safe and blessed week. Take good care as we continue to meet in prayer.